you can tell, we are software engineers, not audiovisual engineers. Um, okay, welcome to the April 2023 Ash office hours. We're going to start off with an announcement, and then we're going to do just a check-in with the core team that's here today. And then after that, we're just going to leave the floor open for questions. These questions can range from the technical to you can range from the technical to even just conceptual things to what's on the roadmap, that sort of things. But first, we have our new member of our core team joining today, Riccardo Benetti. Welcome to the team. And I'll let him maybe do a quick introduction, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're working on, that kind of thing. Floor is yours.
Yeah, so I'm Riccardo. I live in Padova in Italy, and I discovered Ash in Whole Room Talk at uh, Codbeam Europe this year. Sigu Magua presented it to me, and so I discovered it and started to dive into it, and basically when I saw it, it was a great solution for the problems I had at work working on Elixir projects. I try to introduce it where I work, and I'm currently testing it in an open source project. I mainly work on open source solutions for IoT written in Elixirs, and basically there are a couple of projects built with Elixir, and the one I'm working to port to Ash is Hedgehog, which is a fleet management solution. So you can actually see on GitHub how I'm going, and it's going great. It's taking a little bit longer because when I started, I didn't know some things that I know now. So I basically said, okay, let's start from scratch and basically almost rewrite the whole application with Dash. Now that I know manual relationships, I think I could do it more gradually. But so far, so good. I really enjoy Dash, and I'm trying to fix or at least make known the bugs I'm encountering while doing this.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for all of your work. Ricardo's done a lot of really nice things. Some things are that you won't be able to see. Lots of background uh, bug fixes, consistency fixes, things like that. But also there's a lot of interesting things. Most recently, you're working on paginatable relationships, which is a pretty powerful, and like I think once it's done, it'll be a pretty unique selling point for Ash is that you can get that sort of thing for free, which is amazing for GraphQL Relay, and even just for building certain kinds of UIs with live view. Like there's a lot of applications of paginatable relationships. So keep an eye out for all the great work that Ricardo's putting on. You'll see him under the username of Arbino on um, on Discord, and I believe GitHub is the same as well.
Yeah.
Cool. So we'll count that as your update from the core team. And yeah, once again, just congratulations and thanks for being here. So let's go ahead and have Josh go next. So Josh has been on the core team for a long time now, but this is his first chance to make it to the Ash office hours, and the reason for that is we're actually in the same room right now. So he's all the way in Greensboro, North Carolina, from all the way from Australia. So we're going to Geek City Elixir in Chattanooga. We're doing a training and a talk there. So he made the very long trek.
Been a long trek.
Yep.
And yeah, so I left Sydney, got to Lisbon. We went to ElixirConf EU and delivered a training for Ash, fast track to full stack. And then Zach got called up to deliver a talk that he was going to deliver at the last minute. So that's pretty exciting. So watch out for that on YouTube once they release that. I think it's a few months away before they release the videos. But yeah, that was great. Lisbon was fantastic. ElixirConf EU, the last time I went was in London a couple of years ago. and it's always good. It's loads of people, lots of excitement around Elixir and Ash as well. And it was great to do the training. It was a much more refined version of what we did last year at ElixirConf US. We're going to deliver that again at Gig City Elixir in Chattanooga in about 10 days, I think. So I'm in Greensboro where Zach lives, and we're hanging out for the week, which is exciting because we don't get to hang out that often, because I'm in the Sydney time zone, which is why I haven't joined Ash office hours before. And Zach is in the Eastern US. So it's good to be here. I think one more announcement that we could probably sneak in here is that we did get accepted to do the same training at ElixirConf US in August, I believe, in Orlando. So that's very exciting.
Yeah, I think that's going to be, so we learned a lot from the first training. We took a lot of that feedback, and we brought it into the second training, and I'm really proud of all that work, and everybody that took the training said it had a really good time, and I think it's kind of, the sky's the limit at this point. We've got a really great format. It's really interactive, really flexible, and it's a lot of fun, which I think is the part that I was never convinced we were going to be able to get to, because I'm not a professional trainer. Josh has done a lot more training than I have, but so yeah, we managed we managed to get it to a really good point. So if you're interested, it's kind of like it's a beginner training, but we also do cover a pretty wide array of things. So
we squeeze a lot in. One thing that we learned doing it the first time in Orlando last year was that it felt like a 2 or a 3 day training squished into one day, which was a bit too much. So we're definitely talking this week about how to extend it for the more advanced. But yeah, we cover a lot of ground and we make it as interactive as we can. So if you want to do that, look out for the ElixirConf US.
Yep, absolutely. And I'll be giving a talk at Carolina Code Conference. That's another thing coming up later this year in August, I believe. So if anybody's in this area and you want to go to it's not an Elixir specific conference, which I think is kind of exciting. We can kind of talk about, we've had a fair few people that have joined, have kind of become a part of the Elixir ecosystem because of Ash. And I think it's possible that could be kind of an interesting selling point for Elixir. And so I think it'll be really fun to talk to people who, like, I'm always talking to Elixirists about Ash, and it's going to be really interesting to talk to people who aren't familiar with the benefits of the language necessarily, or even some people maybe know barely anything about it except that it exists, right? So that'll be an interesting challenge and opportunity, which I'm excited for. So for my update, typically this is where I would talk about like sort of roadmap type stuff, but right now most of my time is doing is basically handling things that have come up from the 3.0 release, or the release candidates. Fixing little bugs here and there, sometimes there's little bits and pieces we realize, like, oh, that really needs to be made better before this goes out. And then after that, and sort of in tandem with that, is the documentation overhaul. So that's going to be, it's going to take still another week or two likely, and then we'll be able to release Ash 3.0 when the new docs are done, or at least the first go through those are done. But because I'm working on the documentation overhaul, there's not a bunch of stuff on the roadmap worth talking about. To rephrase, there's tons of stuff on the roadmap, right? You can actually go look at it. Everything's, we've documented all of that stuff. You can go to the Ash roadmap. But what I mean is right now, I'm not really working on working on certain features that are going to be coming up in the next week or two, just because we need to focus on the docs. So that's my update.
I've got to say, if you haven't been paying attention, it's worth noting that there have been 38 release candidates.
I think we're at 39 now.
39. It's hard to even keep track. It was 38 last time I looked this morning.
Yeah, and that's just for Ash Core. I think like Ash GraphQL is on 5, and I mean, ultimately for us, we really do believe in like continuous integration, CI/CD at its core, and so I just don't see a lot of value in keeping fixes and stuff like that locked away. So yeah, we release a lot, and you might find that a little strange coming from other frameworks where they release like once every month or two, and whereas we release sometimes a couple times a day.
Actually, that was one of the things that impressed me when I approached Dash, that I would like post on Elixir forum with, I have this problem, and you would reply 3 minutes later saying, okay, can you try the new release now?
Yeah. Yeah, we move quick. Which I think, is it's a nice change of pace, I think, for framework stuff in general.
Yeah, is it worth talking about some of the things that have happened in the last 24 hours? Because they were kind of exciting.
Yeah, I mean, we did something. Josh kind of did that thing where he sniped me. He nerd sniped me. Which is, we have utilities for running calculations. You can say ash.calculate, which is basically, so you can fill in the values for some calculation. Like if you have first name and last name, or if you have a full name calculation, and you just want to say, given this first name and this last name, give me the full name calculation.
Just for context, we were talking about testing and an approach to
Yes.
testing.
So the question was how to test a calculation, right? And so we're like, well, you can sort of unit test a calculation by calling ash.calculate to say, put in these values and then give me the result. But that's actually was pretty limited before yesterday, which is we couldn't, if there was a data layer specific thing like a fragment or something like that could only be run in the data layer, we didn't know what to do with it, and you would get like a nil back because it was an unknown thing. We can't compute this in Elixir. So we added a new callback to data layers called calculate, which will basically expects to be given an expression with no unknown references, so we fill in the values and then it will just run, like in Postgres, for example, it just says like basically select and then like the expression that you have. And so what that allows for is basically like you can run any calculation one-off, even if it relies on data layer features, without necessarily providing records or anything like that. So this allows you to test the calculation without creating any database state. So like if you want to test that the full name calculation does the right thing, you can say ash.calculate full name, and it'll still talk to the database if it has to give you the right answer.
Yeah, so the outcome of that is that you get one-line assertions for calculations, which is typically where your business logic lives. And part of the conversation was, I think one of the value propositions of Ash is that you actually have your business logic in one place. Being able to test it in a really simple way is pretty powerful. So yeah, I accidentally nerd sniped Zach.
Yep.
He's known to be nerd snipeable.
Yeah, I mean, honestly,
So you have to be careful what you say next to him.
My philosophy is follow my nose, and often usually that puts us in a good place. Like when somebody proposes something where the value is outsized from the amount of work that it takes, I'm gonna do whatever that thing is because it's all about most bang for your buck, most maximizing your time. And in this case, it was a pretty easy thing for me to do, and the ability to know that you can unit test any calculation or run any calculation at any time was a pretty outsized differentiator. So yeah, I mean, honestly, I would say please do nerd snipe me. If you can successfully tell me about something that would be so interesting that should be done, tell me about it and it'll get done. Like that's the kind of thing that we're doing here, really.
So I think it's probably worth talking about the conversation that happened before that, because we were talking about just the Ash position on testing, which is, we haven't really mentioned it a lot. And the answer is, well, you just test it the way you test any normal Elixir application. And that's kind of the position. But people have interpreted that in an unfortunate way, meaning that Ash does not have, testing or doesn't support testing, which is definitely not true. But we definitely want to make sure it's easier to test Ash applications.
I was talking about this on Discord the other day, and because one thing I'm experimenting with is trying the approach suggested by Sasa Juric, which is basically testing at the interface level. Because usually sometimes you end up having like create post test from your GraphQL, and then you are testing also create post in your context, and you're basically duplicating lots of stuff. And even more with Ash, what you're testing when you're like testing create post on your domain is testing hash. So I'm actually trying to like test do end-to-end tests and just leave unit tests for like bits of calculations or policies and basically doing so is and is really easy, I think, with also with all the utilities that Ash gives you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, I personally believe that an integration test is worth 1,000 unit tests. So I agree with that, like, pretty much any day. I think you do get some unique abilities with Ash because like the GraphQL will only ever ultimately call an action. And so, if you have an action worth testing, it's like you could test the action directly and you can be confident that those same assertions apply in the GraphQL. But at the same time, it's like if the product effectively is the API, right? Test that, right?
Mhm.
That's the thing that you need to make sure is functioning, and all the rest is kind of supportive. So yeah, I take a pretty liberal view on, I only unit test something when I personally am confused about it. Like when I need the help to understand how it works, then I'll unit test it. And otherwise, I would just rather have a bunch of integration tests that prove my app quacks like a duck and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So, but we do need to have a testing guide that just, the thing is, there's a lot of different cases for how you might test things. And so what we want to have is we want to have a guide that gives you some ideas of things maybe to consider, as well as maybe some things not to do, as opposed to like here's exactly the way that you test your Ash app, because it's going to be really situational to the user.
Yeah.
Okay, let's.
I think there's a question on
Yep.
on YouTube.
Yeah, I was just about to get to that.
Okay.
So yeah, and everybody's watching, please feel free to drop in some questions. I think that was a good update, and so we're basically just going to move into the question answer phase of things. And let's make sure to check Discord to see if there's any questions, if we can. Samuel, hey Samuel. The question is, and if I forget to read the question, somebody please chat and say, hey, you didn't read the question, because this was explained to me multiple times. Got to read the question. So Samuel says, "Hi core team. I'm just getting my feet wet with DDD, event driven, etc. Is Ash a good place to start?" So this is actually a really interesting question. I wish that I had a really simple answer for you. I mean, here's the simple answer. Yeah, it's a great place to start. However, it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? So DDD, and I've had a lot of conversations with folks about this. When you say the word DDD, you could be talking about a lot of different things. So kind of if you're familiar with the concept of like agile development, there's like agile with a capital A, and then there's agile with a lowercase a, which is like kind of just following the basic principles of the initial agile development. DDD is actually quite similar at least in my opinion, right? Which is that there's a lot of things that have come up around DDD around here's how you need to do X and here's how you need to do Y, and everything has to be designed in a certain way, right? And I don't really subscribe to like the blue book, if you're familiar, of like all of that conceptual stuff around domain-driven design. So, however, domain-driven design with lowercase d's, as in the process of modeling your domain and then using a set of primitives like the ones that Ash provides to extract and extrapolate and build systems on top of that, 100% I agree with. So it's kind of difficult when somebody says, is Ash like a domain-driven design framework? And it's like, it depends on if you're using capital D's, basically. If you're talking about the sort of proper, what everybody else calls, what you'll see written on the blog post about domain-driven design.
That's it. In H3, there are domains. So technically, you're doing domain-driven design.
Yeah, and
but yeah, it's definitely a term that's open to interpretation, and there's probably lots of different interpretations these days.
Also, I feel that given the fact that Ash pushes you towards making many different actions, each specialized in a very specific task, this actually is a part of domain-driven development where you have to use the language of your domain, while maybe without Ash doing so many different small functions would be not as easy as with Ash.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of people misinterpret the fact that you've got create, read, update, and destroy actions by default is that, oh, this is just a CRUD framework. But
Yeah.
we really emphasize multiple times in the training that, without actions, a resource is kind of useless. It doesn't really do anything. You're just modeling data, which can sometimes be useful, but it's not generally useful. But we do emphasize that you want to make sure that you're naming your actions appropriately to your domain.
Yeah.
It's also worth pointing out that the domain concept in Ash that used to be called API has a relationship to the context in Phoenix, which came from the bounded context of DDD.
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot of parallels to draw there. And a lot of things that we try to do really is like boil this stuff down to the simplest bits, make it pragmatic, like based on the building blocks that you actually need to build an application, without necessarily locking you out from using certain design patterns, right? So a good example is like with DDD, you might have like an aggregate root where you have an object that encapsulates some, not necessarily object, but like the aggregate root encapsulates some of various other resources or models or whatever behind the aggregate root, and you interact with the aggregate root only, right? And there's nothing that stops you from implementing that design pattern in Ash. And in fact, I would say like there's a lot of things that will help you implement that design pattern. However, in Ash, we don't want to lock people into any one specific design pattern either. At least not that kind of design pattern. And so we don't have like an aggregate root, where it's like we don't. So it's one of those things. We have to cut a nice balance, I think, of flexibility and power, and that involves not tying ourselves to any one concept too much. To go to the second part of your question, actually, event-driven is, strangely enough, just as complicated of a topic. Yeah, we're throwing you in the deep end here, but ultimately, this is a kind of a hard. If you've built some event-driven applications before and some non-event-driven applications before, then this might make more sense. But I believe that event-driven architecture is not really the right way to think about it, right? Event-driven is, I think it should be an implementation detail of how your defined domain operations happen. And what I mean by that is it's like by using event-driven design, you get certain sidelong benefits, but ultimately you want to express the same thing. So like we have like an open bank, like a classic DDD thing is you have like an open bank account, right? And like that's an event called like, open account. And then like there's an event listener somewhere that creates an account with the $0 balance or whatever, all that sort of stuff, right? And frankly, I think if you shape your application like the pattern under the hood, what you end up with is you end up accepting a bunch of limitations of that pattern and also losing the flexibility to change your mind later or to like, implement new and other interesting patterns, like if the guarantees you need change. So to that end, that's kind of the purpose of an Ash resource. Like when you have a resource like bank account, might have an open action, and that's like a create action that creates it just, and in default Ash, like if you just use Ash Postgres and you say create, we just create the thing in the database. There's no event stream, there's nothing like that. However, it's actually quite trivial. We even have a package available on GitHub. It's not published anywhere yet just because we haven't used it in production yet. We want to, we're not going to just start throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. But what I've been telling people for a long time is you should define your application in a declarative way that you can get event-driven for free if you want it. Like you should be able to opt into the guarantees and drawbacks based on what you need. And so we have that exact same thing. We have that with Ash Events on GitHub, where what you do is you just add the extension to your resource. And now when you call a create action, it doesn't create it, it creates an event. And then you can decide with literally one line of code, like one flag, do you want to be event-driven or event-sourced? So event-driven means that you write the event in the same transaction as you implement the side effect or the effect of the event, right? And then event sourced means you write the event and then you have something later that's like something listening to events, later down the road, and then calls back and does the actual stateful thing, right? It's a really subtle difference, but they have different guarantees and there's different reasons you might choose between them. But what's nice about it is you write your code the same way regardless. You write the create operation and what it looks like and what it means to your domain. And then if you want event driven or event sourced or whatever, you just add it to the resource. It's quite simple. So yeah, I think that's my take. I would say it is a good place to start with those things. Unless you're looking for whatever sort of classic example, here's exactly what we mean when we say DDD, then there are DDD specific frameworks or event oriented specific frameworks where you're going to get like, this is a bunch of DDD specific opinions or a bunch of event driven specific opinions. Whereas we're, I think, a lot more pragmatic, and we want to let you have either of those things or all of those things, and that matters.
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say that Ash isn't going to teach you DDD or event sourcing or what have you, but it's possible to implement most of those things in Ash. And I think if you can't implement some of those concepts, then maybe that's something we should talk about. Barnabas, one of the other core team members who isn't here right now, also dabbled with, and I don't know what state it's in, but he had a way of, what's it called?
Commanded.
Yeah, Ash Commanded,
Mm-hmm.
which is the Elixir event sourcing framework. It's one take on how to do event sourcing in Elixir. And you might want to take a look at that, because basically declaring actions on resources allows you to kind of abstract away from how those actions are implemented, and you can make them commands that generate events that add events to an aggregate route and all that kind of thing. So it's certainly ideas that we've been playing with, and I'd certainly like to see that explored more.
Yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. We've got some more questions. So how well is Ash itself tested? Let's see.
Open up the
Yeah,
Ash test
so
folder.
I find an issue. Yeah. And I look at the changes. I can't see if there are new tests, so I'm wondering if I should have my own tests in my app to make sure that there are no aggression when I upgrade Ash. Yeah, so I am not religiously on the TDD train. However, we have thousands of tests all across the board. And what I will say is many times you will not see a test for something in Ash, because Ash is like a core package that supports functionality that's exposed often in other packages. So a good example is up until recently, the ETS in-memory data layer did not support atomics or bulk actions. And so when we would fix something with atomics or bulk actions, a test in core was not possible. And so we have a whole test suite in Ash Postgres that tests atomics. And because it is the only data layer, it was until recently the only data layer that could do that behavior. And so we tested it all there. So there are lots of times where, and it's actually part of our CI. So this is, I think, I would say Ash is very well tested on balance, right? We don't have a religious 100% test coverage line, but on balance, I think it's very well tested. And we run all of the other GitHub, all of our core packages. Whenever we commit to the core to Ash, it runs the tests of all of our packages with the new upgraded version. So we find out as soon as we break a package. So it's actually quite safe for us to have a bunch of tests for Ash core behavior in something like Ash Postgres. So that would be why you might see like a fix committed to Ash core without a test, is because sometimes the only way to test if that actually works is to test it through, or like in the context of a data layer that leverages that behavior. With that said, it was illustrated to us that the stuff we had recently done for 3.0 and atomics, we found a little bit more bugs than were acceptable, and the primary reason for that is because the ETS data layer didn't support atomics, and so we couldn't test them just in core, which you often don't want to see like a bunch of really granular tests in Ash Postgres for how the core validations work or the changes work.
It's probably worth just pointing out that when Ash is testing itself, it uses the ETS data layer.
Yeah,
and because that's in Ash core.
Yeah, so and if we call it ETS or ETS, if you're familiar, it's Erlang term storage. It's like the in-memory database that's available in Elixir. So yeah, that's the main point. Sometimes there are tests that are in a bunch of different places. And what honestly, sometimes something is just in my mind not worth the testing. Like very rarely, but my point is like sometimes it's like that's a typo. You know what I mean? Like that was a we had a we said like some map.foo when we should have said map.bar, and it's like I could write a very specific regression test, but ultimately it's like there are better, more bigger tests that we'll write over time that cover that code better. So for like a very specific regression, there isn't always a test, but there is always an idea of like how well is X thing tested, and we work on that, as a sort of separate thing.
Something I appreciate is that you accept and merge failing tests for as PRs. I think that's a nice way to, if you have a bug in your application and you're able to write a reproduction in the Ash test suite, you can just open a PR with a failing test, and you don't have to do, okay, I found the failing test, now I also have to fix the bug.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I would actually much rather you make a pull request with a failing test than and no fix than a fix and no test, right? So I'll approve the failing test and I'll actually merge it still failing and make it fail the Ash core build until it's resolved, right? So I mean, in most contexts, right? I'm not saying I'll always do that, but most of the time. So yeah, we really appreciate that, and there is no better way to put yourself on my good list or whatever, my nice list, than to submit a failing test or a reproduction of some kind. Because for me, the difference, and other core team members will say the same thing, like with a failing test, I can fix almost anything in like 30 minutes, right? Like tops. Without a failing test, it's like 4 hours because to get the same understanding that the person who encountered the bug was, to reproduce it all, to set up the right, there's so much investigation that goes into that. Ash is really big, and understanding how to dial in exactly what behavior caused the issue can make it take a really long time. So yeah, failing tests, love them.
Also, it might be worth talking about the way that Zach nerd sniped me earlier today. I wasn't aware of a library called Mix Install Examples. And he said, why not do an Ash example? What it is effectively a test suite for Mix Install, which is useful in Livebooks, but it's also useful for adding dependencies to Elixir scripts. So EXS files. I put the PR I put in, and it was just shocking, like how small you could get a Phoenix, Hello World example in there. It just shocked me how simple it was. I've posted in the Discord general channel my PR.
I'll post it in the YouTube chat as well.
Yeah, and it was shocking how simple it is. It's almost like a little tutorial, like how small can an Ash app be?
Yeah.
It creates a domain, it adds a very small resource to that, and then we run through all the actions. We define code interfaces because you can now define those on the domain themselves. And we show how you can go through the code interface and what actions are doing under the covers. So it's kind of illustrative, but if you want to create a reproduction that you can post in a PR chat, then that's a pretty useful resource for a lot of libraries.
Yeah, absolutely. Super useful for reproductions.
So actually, since we're talking about code interfaces, today I was discussing with a colleague, so maybe you can tell me what's the vision on this. So the idea is that now code interfaces are supported on the domain. Is it like I know that the answer is there is no blessed way because you can do it both ways. But what you would see is the blessed way, because we were deciding if going towards the code interfaces on the domain or on the resources themselves, and we have pros and cons on both sides.
So here's the, I mean, look, if you know me, I have an interesting philosophy, which is important. I think it matters to the success of this project for me not to be overly opinionated about certain things. So like in some frameworks, they say there's only one right way to do things, which is really convenient until it isn't convenient at all. So that's my point. However, you've caught me on a rare example where I will tell you the right answer. And I should probably just document this better in the code interface examples. But as we've made this change, we've seen how it shapes up, and it's had the effect that we wanted. And ultimately, you should use the code interfaces on the domain. Now, code interfaces existing on the resources That's never going to go away. But if you imagine you have a domain with 50 resources in it, right? And you have an operation called like create post. If you have a code interface on the post resource called create post, you kind of have and then you have some like a live view or some other task or whatever calling into it. You kind of lock an implementation detail, like which is that the action exists on post. And that is, generally speaking, that's a problem, because when you extend that out like 1,000 times, all of a sudden everything are like the resources are in a way kind of internal to the domain. So it's just you don't want to spread out your interface like that. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to be pushing that even more in that direction. So you'll be able to add JSON API routes and GraphQL mutations and queries in the domain itself. And it's important that like the resource still plays a major role. So the resource still is in charge of defining its type and its fields and all these sorts of things, right? But the declaration of the interface can live in one place, and I think that is really valuable. So yeah, and if you want to use the one on the resource, what I would say is you can use that for internal usage, like where if you have one resource that in a hook needs to call some other resource or something, like you can define it on the resource it calls because it's a kind of an explicit thing. Or you can use it for things like the define calculation. That can make a lot of sense, right? So the first name example we have, where you say ash.calculate, you can use the code interface. There's a thing called define calculation, where you point it at a resource in a calculation and it'll run that calculation for you. So putting that on user sometimes actually does make more sense. So accounts.user.firstname is like, from a design perspective, it's not like accounts.firstname. It's like, what if you have multiple different types of people or whatever, right? So you still need that flexibility, and it is still up to you. But in general, you should prefer to put it on the domain.
Yeah, I think when I saw that, it was like, oh my god, this is it. This is how you should have been doing it, because it's really easy in large resources to have the code interface sort of hidden way down in the file, and it's hard to see what the big picture interface to your domain is. And having it just very easily exposed on the domain is very.
I think I'll also add, the reason it was on the resource was not because we originally decided it was best for it to be on the resource. It was actually a technical limitation that drove us to that design decision.
Oh, what was the limitation?
Compile time dependencies. So the basic problem is we've come up with a lot of cool, I don't want to call them hacks, but they are hacks around like preventing compile time dependencies from one module to another. And so one of the changes that came in with 3.0 is now, instead of calling like your domain.function, you call ash.function. And that actually is not just because, that's not only because that is a nicer interface and stops you from spreading around all of your stuff, right? It's also because that prevents the compile time link between some like piece of behavior or some module somewhere and the domain in question. And so that allows us for the domain to have a compile time dependency on all of the resources and nothing else to have a compile time dependency on the domain. So that kind of inversion allowed us to go and put them on the domain like they probably always should have been. Okay,
thanks. You saved me a lot of bike shedding for tomorrow.
Perfect. I like to hear it, and like you caught me on a rare thing where I actually do have a pretty clear opinion on that.
Yeah, and if you want to look at that example, and posted the link, that Ash mix and install example is a pretty good, Ash 3 example.
Yeah, it does the code interface on the
How you
domain.
do that.
Okay.
There's a question over there saying, is it safe to do minor versions?
Oh, that was I think it was part of the question before that, like, i.e., is it safe to do upgrade minor versions? And the answer is yes.
So we've had a bunch of projects internally at Alembic that have lived on main very happily. It enables us to get fixes and updates very quickly. So we found that a relatively safe thing to live on main. So my versions should be safe, and if they're not,
Yep. All right. So Samuel Owen said, "Thank you for the." They said, "What a great answer." So I appreciate that. And also has another question: what areas of Ash would you appreciate the most help from the community? So there are there's really two main areas. The first one is documentation. And what I mean is not necessarily, please come in and write tutorials and stuff like that. What I mean is, and this is actually happening more and more and more, I've noticed, and so I really appreciate it, which is when you are confused by something, or when you have you have a tough time figuring some X, Y, or Z thing out, I will happily accept like a one-line documentation PR that's like better wording that might have helped you, or just an additional comment here that says like, hey, don't, like, even if it's something very specific maybe bites you and makes you waste an hour trying to figure it out, we can put like a note, be careful if you do exactly that scenario because you might have a, right. So to me, we really want to, what happens a lot is people will use Ash, they'll hit a roadblock, and they'll chug and chug and chug and figure out a way around it, and we don't have a chance to capture that and help prevent other people from hitting that same roadblock.
Would it be fair to say that even an issue saying that this documentation was ambiguous or confusing and I couldn't figure it out, even if you don't have a solution for the docs, having an issue that points out where you found it confusing would be so super helpful?
Yep.
Because not capturing that makes it really hard to fix it.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, maybe someday in the future when the project is like, if we've got, I don't know, 50,000 GitHub stars or something, maybe we'll have a different, like a non-GitHub issue process for improving the documentation. But as it stands right now, honestly, GitHub issues are a great place for this sort of stuff. I know some projects are very like finicky about what you use their GitHub issue tracker for. Like, no, only bugs, and but no, we're fine. You can use it for proposals, you can use it for questions, you can use it for whatever you want, honestly. There are better places for questions, but if you want, I don't care. Whatever gets us your feedback and gets us improving the framework, we'll meet you where you're at. So just, get us that feedback and get us that information, and that is really...
And do it when you hit it. Don't sort of save it away for later. Like, write the issue, make it happen before you forget, because it, often once an hour passes, it's kind of gone.
Yep. Okay, another question from Albin. Any updates on UI generation? No. I would like, okay, let me...
I don't know, weren't you working on Ash Phoenix form with union types this morning?
Well, yeah, but that's kind of it's not, I don't think that's the UI generation that Alvin's talking about.
Sort of.
I mean, we have like the data structure for forms that will help you build certain kinds of UIs. But and maybe you can clarify kind of what you mean by UI generation, but what I'm interpreting UI generation as in, given a resource and an action, make components or make pages or make like an app that uses it. And we have Ash Admin, which is theoretically, it's a UI generation tailored for a specific purpose. But we don't have something currently. There are people in the community working on it. Frank Dugan's working on Pyro, which is kind of where you'd want to look at the moment. It's still a work in progress. I haven't had a chance to use it or anything like that, but that is an ongoing community effort for UI generation. And we're doing some mise en place, if you're familiar with we have some stuff that's like long-term going to make, I think, a pretty big deal splash in that area. But we're not even close to where we would kind of talk about it or make any concrete plans. So
probably the biggest missing piece for UI generation, and honestly, Ash Admin generates an entire stuff. But what's missing in the Phoenix world and the LiveView world is components. There is no sort of one-stop component library that's useful right now. I mean, there's lots of choices. There's a lot of trade-offs between choosing one. There's not one that you would obviously choose above any other one. So I think that's probably the thing that needs to be there before you get your major UI generation from Ash. But it's possible, and Ash Admin does show how that is feasible to do now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add, like, sorry to phrase this. Certain amount of UI generation on your own is actually not that difficult, right? So if you want to write a component called like form component that takes a resource and an action and like makes a form, and like you can actually, all the introspection stuff that we use internally to like make your app work is available to you right now. So you can say, like, in your form component, you can say, you can look at the action, you can say what are the inputs that it accepts. You can loop over the inputs and you can say what is the type of the input, and then you can render an input. And like obviously that's work that you're doing, but that actually, I would say, in my experience, most people think that's actually a lot harder than it is in the real, to do on a case by case basis. So like, it's actually pretty straightforward. And the reason for that is that when you're doing it for yourself, you only have to deal with your thing, like your whatever the invariance of hash
Yeah,
that
your
you've used.
types, your components that you want to use.
Yeah, exactly. Now, if for us to build that, we have to build it for everyone, and it's a much bigger project. So I would suggest, like, if you're interested in the concept of UI generation, take a look at actually all the introspection functions that we have available, like in ash.resource.info, to say like, you can use that to do all kinds of things. And that's how all of the extensions work. Like Ash.json API uses that to generate an open API specification and to generate a JSON schema validator that validates all requests. And Ash GraphQL uses it to generate all the type system. It's a fully typed version of your app in GraphQL, right? So we use this sort of stuff everywhere. And I would suggest it's not that hard, relatively speaking, So, give that a shot if you're really looking to kind of go that direction.
Probably a guide would be helpful, much more than a generic way to generate UIs, because again, if you have to make it so configurable that it's universal, you're going to explode.
Yeah, and I would say like that is a very good point, which is that the reason we haven't done UI generation is exactly what you just described, which is that what's the right way to phrase this? The variability, the variance of an interface is significantly higher than the variance of your actual domain model, right? So for your domain model, you might have like a create post, but then all of the detailed information required to provide like a user experience around creating a post is like massive compared to the information of what should happen when a post is created. So like, do you want a form wizard that steps you through the things? Do you want how do you want it to? Do you want validations to show up at the now? And there's just a millions of little tiny points that go into a user interface. And so what we have to do is find a way. Like I don't think that the answer will ever really be like magic full UI generation. I think what we need to do is find a way that lets you leverage the information we have about your application and to save you time and to make it simpler. But then still kind of allow you maybe like a good like some stuff that I'm playing with, just to kind of like tease a little bit, is the idea that you can declare like all of your data sources. You can use like you can have how do I say this without going too deep? You can have like a format for the data required to power a view, and an engine that automatically queries for all of that data and handles everything for you. So you like point it at your Ash resources and say it's like, I need the current user and all blah, 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 blah. And it solves all of that. And all you have to do is just do the UI bit, right? Not the, yeah, I think Bernadette, I'm pretty sure that's your first name. Sorry if I get that wrong, but Bernadette said, started with Ash Admin and just removed it last week because like you said, I built my custom UI. And honestly, like, we've kind of talked about in the past, like we almost don't want Ash Admin to get too good. Like it's very useful and it's a pretty raw tool and it exists. And I mean, we have clients that use it, they love it, but at the same time, we don't want to get this point where you get so far into using it that you don't actually like, that you can't get back out, that you can't like say, okay, now let's make a custom UI and you have to replicate all this crazy complex behavior. It's like, look, you get it. Here's a good working admin UI, like a super admin UI, just to get you started, and then go from there. So if we do want to make Ash Admin like a much better product, ultimately we're going to have to rewrite it, in my opinion. Yeah, Albin, I will tell you, you're barking up the right tree, just maybe a little early. We've got some really interesting stuff that's going to happen. It's just, this is a long road, and I think to do like I don't know how much, I think I've said this a couple times, but I spent 1.5 years building a no-code platform before I stopped. Basically, I made some decisions that I don't think that was actually the right path. Like no code, I don't think is the right answer. ultimately, I think that we have a unique perspective on what the future of low code, no code looks like. But our unique perspective is that you need a whole lot more to get started than like a web UI. Like we have to have a foundation, a massive foundation that's built, I don't know, with a sort of clarity of purpose, I guess maybe is the right way to phrase it. And so the truth is, it just takes a really long time to build this kind of thing right. I think people have built it wrong thousands of times now, and if we want to build it right, it's going to take a long time. So we'll get there someday. The Heeks visual editor is actually a pretty interesting concept. I've been meaning to look into Beacon to see kind of like, I don't really see a reason why you couldn't use their visual editor, but again, I haven't actually used them. I haven't used it together to see kind of like how it would work, or if there's any sort of synergy there.
Me neither. Certainly, we'll take a look.
Yeah. All right, so we're at about 57 minutes. We don't have to stop at an hour. I just want to let everybody know, like, we need more, after an hour, if there aren't more questions, then we will stop. So, keep the questions coming if you have them. Yeah, vast CNC, absolutely right. There's a lot of problems with no code and low code, and one of them is that the ones that are data oriented are too data oriented. Like it's like put a database into a UI, you know what I mean? Like, and you don't have a place to define a domain logic, business logic independent from your data.
I think that's like an industry-wide problem that I've seen across sort of, I went to Jamstack conference. I think it was after ElixirConf US last year. And what I saw was a bunch of front-end engineers working in JavaScript, and at the front, sort of talking to back-end as services to do various things, storage, asset management, that kind of stuff. But the question I had was like, where is the business logic going here? And it felt like it's either living in the front end, and because there's no middle tier, which is what Ash is really taking care of for you. Like we start at the middle and go out, rather than starting at the edges and go in. What ends up happening is your business logic just gets smeared all over the place. And I would hate to be a CTO or a CIO not being able to sleep at night, realizing that actually all of your IP, all of the interesting things that you've done have just been smeared through the front end, which will last maybe a year tops, or it's smeared across various back-end third-party providers, and you don't really have your business logic or your data in one place. Ash and Elixir, tend to be able to aim to just capture all of that IP in one place. Ultimately, for me, that's the goal. Is can we put this all in one place and keep it safe? We can rewrite view layers happily because we haven't put any special logic there, and that's reusable business logic is the goal here, because that's honestly the special part of what you're building for most applications. It's what are the rules around your business.
Yeah, vast CNC. I've actually thought about trying to like push that middle out angle, like that wording, especially is just because it's got got some fun Silicon Valley links, but but also just because it's true.
I'm currently rewatching Silicon Valley.
Yeah,
I'm doing a rewatch.
Yeah, maybe we don't want to use that reference, but anyway, I think we've actually had this problem a lot with Ash, which is that people say and Barnabas was talking about this in his talk, or like people would say like, what did you consider like when you looked at the alternatives to Ash? And ultimately, like there isn't an alternative to Ash, at least not in the Elixir world, right? And I can't say definitively this doesn't exist in other places, but the alternative is your handwritten code. Like it's not, there isn't another application framework that I know of that is like there's a lot of okay, that's not true. There are application frameworks, but they're not like general purpose application frameworks, right? So there's like Commanded, which is like a framework for allowing you to build event sourced systems. So you kind of build your app in that way. There's frameworks that are like designed around data structure patterns, like so there's things like that, right? And all of them make these, in my opinion, massive compromises, which is that like your business logic is shaped like some application of your business logic, not the rules itself, right? And and I don't think there is an alternative to that right now. Basically what happens is when you build an application, if you build for long enough and you build enough of it, you build your own thing like Ash. Like you have your paginator and your filterer and your policy, your authorizers and your calculations, and you have those kinds of things that ultimately have to exist. And so the real question isn't do you want to use them? It's do you want to use ours or do you want to write your own? That's the actual question you have to ask yourself.
I just pasted in the general channel in Discord the architecture slide I've been using for a while.
Okay.
And it really focuses on Ash is taking care of the domain layer or the middle tier or the application logic layer, business logic layer, whatever you want to call it. It's the middle part that Phoenix actively and explicitly says we don't care what you do in this layer. They have some opinions, but it really leaves you, with some context, with some modules in a context folder, with some functions that call Ecto. And Ash really, part of its main mission is to take care of opinions in that layer and bring your business logic in one place.
Yep.
And then generating all the other stuff on the edges, like on the view layer.
Yeah, so we have a question from Samuel here, which is any book recommendations from the core team. Doesn't have to be code based either. So okay, this is a little bit weird, but it's very rare that I actually read a programming book, and that's not because I don't like them or because I don't think that they're valuable things, but ultimately I am a super tactile person. Like I need to get my hands on it. I need to break things. I need to try stuff out. And for me, like reading things, it doesn't usually work that well for me. But what I found is interesting is I found that I'm the exception to that rule. I found that there's a lot of that there's value in that, and that's one of the reasons why my documentation is often very like dry. Like it's very like practical. Here's how, not a lot of here's why. And but I have to say, in contrast to all that, we do have an Ash book coming. Rebecca Lee is the main author, and I'm a secondary author. And it's still going to be a while. We have a lot of writing left to do. But I've been reading that, and her style is amazing. She has that thing that I don't really have, which is just I don't know a kind of a way to capture in the writing, and it's not really. It feels a little bit more like kind of going on an adventure than I don't know, like a tutorial. So my book recommendation is I don't know, wait a while and then buy that book.
I've got a book recommendation, and yeah, I'm similar. I don't read a lot of programming books, certainly not beginning to end. And a lot of them do have a fairly explanatory narrative style. Those that like, and most people tend to like that. But Gödel, Escher, Bach by Douglas Hofstadter is a timeless classic book about code and philosophy and life, puzzles, and logic, and all that kind of stuff. So check that out. It's pretty good.
So starting with a new junior non-Elixir team, hoping that Ash will help us structure the business layer because the Phoenix you are on your own is a bit lacking, especially for beginners. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I've been talking about this. I don't know if you follow me on Twitter, but I've talked about this on Twitter recently, which is that I actually think Phoenix and Ecto are, even though what I'm proposing is like, because I think there are things potentially missing from just using Phoenix and Ecto, I think they're extremely high quality tools. And I think part of that is because Phoenix ultimately stays out of the how you build your application. Like the stuff that they give you is just functions and Ecto, right? Which is really, in my opinion, it skips the whole application concept, right? It's like you do, there is no application layer in a basic Phoenix app except for what you sort of hand grow. And so I do think that one of the value propositions for Ash is that you have a lot of regularity, because that's one of the big problems with the Phoenix app is that your app. It's not that it's hard to write a context function. It's that you never really know when you start getting your app gets bigger, especially if you have a big team. You never really know what you're going to get when you open up a context or when you look at a context function. Like, what can this? So you have like a list these things, and it's like, what can it do? Can I sort it? Can I filter it? What options does it have? What's the interface for calling this? And they always grow in weird and wacky ways. And it's like, so one of them, for instance, you have a context function for listing posts, and it takes a sort argument, and it'll apply a sort on the list. And then the other one, instead of saying a sort argument, it asks you have like named things, like give me the top or the worst or something, right? And then it does the sorting. And so you end up with this absolute spaghetti mess. And it's not really Phoenix's fault in a way, right? It's really like, not to be, it's your fault, right? It's the developer's fault. But the whole point is that like that's actually really hard to avoid without a structure. So I think Ash adds a lot of regularity to that, and I've found that that has panned out, right? So there's one thing to have that as a theory, and there's another thing to see that actually working in practice. And what I found is that like we're an agency, we've got a lot of different applications built on Ash, and when I go and visit a resource or a domain or whatever, I have a lot of expectations that will always hold true. Like I know that, okay, in order for something to be happening, they're calling an action, right? So I can go with what action's being called, go figure out, okay, here's the action. And then I know where the I know there's one or two places to look for like what might affect how an action works. And typically they end up being named in a consistent way and having a consistent structure. So yeah, that's probably one of the biggest benefits of Ash, even more than like, fast development which we have, I think it is fast to build things with Ash, especially once you know what you're doing. But just the fact that we give you that repeatable process and tool set makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and from running an agency or a consultancy, when you have a lot of projects and a bunch of teams doing lots of different things, being able to, it's sort of a fractal description of an architecture is that you should be able to slice anywhere in your application and have it look the same. And if it's all done in Ash, it's generally pretty much the same, and you would expect all the things to be in the right place, and they are. There's very few exceptions to that, and what we want is to be able to do that across all projects as well, across all time. And we want to be able to slice it off and say, look, it looks the same pretty reliably everywhere, which means that we can rotate teams, we can hand over more easily, we can debug old code that hasn't been touched in a while more easily. Yeah, it's what you expect.
I think there's a really important bit here, and this is again one of the reasons why I can kind of like sometimes I hesitate to say things like in too strongly worded because we talk about the consistency, but ultimately like that consistency is in another implementation could be a drawback, not a help, right? Like if the thing that we're making consistent is not the right pattern and there's no way out when said consistency might be applied too liberally, then you actually have a problem. Instead, it hurts not helps in those situations.
Yeah, and this calls back to one of the comments earlier about that no code and low code eventually is going to hit the wall. The thing I see about the low code and no code platforms, and we've been converting Excel spreadsheets since forever into web applications, so it's not a new thing. I would argue Excel or a spreadsheet is the ultimate low code, no code platform. However, for prototyping stuff, but effectively it can't really exist as a tool within a no code or a low code platform unless it's been really done many times before and the patterns have been extracted. And so there's probably exceptions to that, but ultimately you can't do anything truly innovative or novel in a no code platform. You have to sort of tread the path that's been trodden before and use the patterns that have been extracted. So you inevitably hit the wall, and I think this is where Ash kind of lives on the software engineering side of the low code part. We kind of think of it as low code for software engineers, but it's playing in a space that hasn't been that explored. And so when you hit the wall, inevitably you can go back to your software engineering and do whatever you need to do the old-fashioned way.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the thing is we have this concept of like progressive escape hatches. Like you can start at the really like a good example is like you could think of it as like escape hatch. It's really just a feature, but you could add a change to an action that modifies what the action does, right? But then you're like, you know what? I need to change how the action is actually executed. It's different than what Ash thinks it should do. So then you can make a manual action, right? Or with a read action, there's an option called modify query where you get the ecto query and you do whatever you want with it, right? But then you go one step up and there's generic actions, right? A generic action is you tell us the arguments and what the output type is, and then you do whatever you want, right? And then the beauty of it is you always have that one further step up, which is you write your own code somewhere else in a controller or in a module of your choosing or whatever, but you can still call into all of your Ash code. Like there's nothing that stops you from saying like, okay, I need to do a couple special things and then now I can create this post or this whatever, right? All that sort of stuff. And in my experience, that's actually a feature that like the fact that when something is super special, it lives in its own, well, it has its own sort of bounded like blast radius of specialness, right? So like when you see a manual action, you think, okay, I know that this has the same inputs and outputs of the action itself. So you already have a bunch of stuff, like you know what it's customizing, but you're like, but something about the internals of the action had to be different, and so it's a manual action. But then if I go up and I see a generic action, I'm like, okay, this isn't like a normal action. This can do any, like, so you have all of these, like, you have the ability to understand more about why the escape hatch exists based on how the escape hatch is actually shaped. And that's really useful. So if I go into somebody's app and I see a controller that they wrote themselves that handles a request, I'm like, got it. This is like totally special. Because if they would have used Ash if they could. That's what been my experience. You would pipe it through your resources if you could. So something is really special here. So you can really like removes that mental burden on you as a developer of like having to constantly gather context everywhere you go. Like, how does this behave? What is it? What's the rules? And instead, it's like you can focus on just the parts that actually matter, which I think is super useful.
Yeah, I recently started reviewing Ash code because I introduced another team member in the project I'm porting to Ash. And actually, reviewing Ash code is a very nice experience because, as you were saying, like you can see the pieces that stick out and you can concentrate on them. If you see the fold created, you know that it's going to do that thing and that's that thing alone. But you are able to remove the noise and concentrate on the actual bits that are relevant to what you're reviewing.
Yeah, that's great. Love it. Okay, so we've been going for almost an hour and a half now. I guess an hour 15. We still have some, if you have some more questions, you can drop them in now. But otherwise, we'll probably be signing off here in a minute. We'll give people a minute to say, ask some questions or say goodbye or whatever. I mean, there are 13 people here, so if you have questions, we're here. Here we go. Might be technical, but do you support renaming tables with relationships? I tried changing an existing table name once in Ash and generate migrations, but it would fail on some foreign key error. We do support it. What is possible, I think what is more likely the bug that you encountered was that when we generated migrations, we maybe did something out of order in the migration. Oh, tried changing an existing tables unless the table is empty. Yeah, that we can't solve for data conditions like that. Like you might have to, so the migration generator, think of it like it's going to be a best effort, do as much as it can. And sometimes if there's like a data condition, for instance, if you make a field required that it wasn't required before, we're going to make a, or allow nil false, we're going to make a migration that sets it to null false. But the database is going to yell at you if you try to run that migration because there's data that's got null values, right? And the truth is we have no real way to handle that. We don't know what value you want to go there for all of the other default things. Like, if there's a default value, then we do have to handle that. But anyway, you get my point. So you were probably running into either a data condition where you have to handle some data change that yourself, and there's really nothing we can do. Or if there is a bug there, it would be in operations out of order. Like maybe we changed, we changed the foreign key after we modified the table or something, and you might have to. So sometimes like it can't be perfect because maybe it could be perfect, but not really. You still have to review that code and consider the steps it's taking against your database and make it, your own decisions there.
Absolutely. And I think the problem with auto-generated migrations is that Ash generally does such a good job that you just trust it a bit too much and think that it can do everything when actually it's not. And I think one of those things that if you haven't seen this, if you do any destructive actions, I can't remember exactly, does it come in commented and you have to review it and uncomment it to make sure that the destructive action.
Yeah, we won't remove a column, which actually can cause a problem if you don't look. Like you have to look at those migrations.
You have to look and review the migrations.
Actually, so Albin, for you in your case, when you said unless the table is empty, that it's a data condition. Like you can't say because the foreign key is validated. If you change the table and the IDs that are still in the table are now pointing at like there's nothing in that table with a matching ID. Oh, yeah, it is an out of order migration. That's what it is. It's not that it's out of order migration, it's that there's actually no, yeah, it's probably we changed the foreign key reference before we renamed the table, and we needed to rename the table before we changed the foreign key reference or something like that. But report a bug. We'll figure it out. And honestly, though, those things are kind of lower priority, the migration generator stuff, because like you're supposed to review it anyway. You have to run it on test data anyway, and you can hand edit it, and we're not going to go back in and edit the migration. So like, there's easy workarounds in general, but we still want to fix those things. Cool. Esper, thank you. Says love the way the project is going. Thank you for that. And you got thanked for your book shout out. Go to Lesher and Bach. I haven't read that. I'll have to try it out.
It's pretty great. Timeless book.
All right, folks. I think we can call it here. One more shout out for Ricardo Benetti joining the core team. Thank you for being here. Welcome to your first Hash office hours.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right. Bye, everyone.